This year I've already read more books than all of last year.
I'll look around.
Hey there guys, and welcome back to UnJaded. Jade. Oh, it's so close up. Honestly, I feel like a bit of an imposter right now because I have never made a booktube video before. But I receive so many questions on Instagram all the time about books I'm reading, book recommendations. So I thought it was time to discuss some of what I've been reading this year. I am the least organized person when it comes to reading. I don't plan my books in advance. I don't really plan to read. I'm still at university, so I don't really have that much free time to read. But most of these books have come from me going into a bookshop, promising myself that I won't buy anything, and inevitably coming out with like 5 books in my hands. Here we are. Somehow I read more books than last year already. So yeah, I'm excited to chat about them. And generally I also don't like the whole mindset of I read X number of books, I read more books, because that's not what reading is about. I love reading slowly. The slower the better. The more I can absorb a book, the more I can be in the story for longer with the characters, or the more I can be mulling over the self-help advice, the better. For the first time in my life, I've started tracking the books that I'm reading on Storygraph, and it produces a cute little display to expose my reading taste, and I think it just really sums me up. Reflective. I do love a bit of self-reflection with a hint of emotional Pisces and a healthy dash of please inform me because I love learning. And I've got a solid 50-50 of non-fiction and fiction this year, and I'm gonna rank them best to worst for fiction and for non-fiction. Actually, best to worst. You know what, I'm just gonna totally 180 that. I'm gonna do worst to best so that I can say all the controversial things about the books that I've ranked as worst, because they might be someone's favorite book, and hopefully we can end on like a positive note. Feel free to grab yourself some tea. This is my casual magic of today, and I hope you enjoy. But first, a huge thank you to the sponsor of today's video, Surfshark. I have been using Surfshark for the last year. I think I first heard about them through Jack Edwards. I'm someone who travels a lot because of university, and I'm spending most of summer in Berlin right now with friends. And what Surfshark does is it's basically a VPN. It lets you change your virtual location. So say for example, I'm in Berlin, I want to access BBC iPlayer because I want to watch an episode of Killing Eve. That is literally impossible when you're not in the UK. It just doesn't let you. If I just pop onto the Surfshark app, I click change my virtual location to the UK, then all of a sudden I can go on BBC iPlayer, I can watch whatever I want. And what's also so cool is it's insane for data privacy. I tend to use random Wi-Fi's in cafes because I love working in cafes every day, and Surfshark will encrypt your data so it's private, protected, and it just gives me so much peace of mind. If you travel a lot, if you study abroad and you want to watch your favorite programs when you're there, check out Surfshark. You can get a whopping 83% off, and with that code you also get 3 months for free. Mad. Let's get into it. By far, the worst non-fiction book I read this year was Can't Hurt Me by David Goggins. And I know, David Goggins fans are gonna come after me for this one. This is such an acclaimed book in the self-help genre. On YouTube, people adore this book. And I can see why, because David Goggins is basically a memoir, self-help style book, and he is inspirational. He had such a tough upbringing with an abusive father. He lived basically in poverty in the US. He's also a black man who had to navigate those different struggles of racial prejudice and discrimination growing up. His father was really abusive. His family was quite unstable. He then managed to go from being really overweight and really depressed to being this insane powerhouse guy. He managed to get through all the training of the Navy SEALs, which if you know what the Navy SEALs are, like, that's tough stuff. Then he broke loads of world records, like Ironman challenges, insane physical bodily challenges. But I felt like it was the most toxic masculine book ever. It was toxic masculinity in a book. He would romanticize pain and suffering of the body in such an annoying way. Every time his body was literally breaking, like his knee was like deforming. It was that moment that rather than deciding to rest, to rejuvenate, to recover his body and then go again, he decided to push harder because he's not a pussy. I knew how to push through pain, and my body had almost always responded with performance. I wasn't going to quit just because my knee was barking. It would come around eventually. And then it didn't come around, and his knee was like really permanently damaged. So I sought out pain, fell in love with suffering, and eventually transformed myself from the weakest piece of shit on the planet into the hardest man God ever created. Wilmoth became as close to a healthy father figure as I've ever had. He didn't coddle me. He didn't tell me he loved me or any of that fake ass sappy shit. It's just not my vibe. I really understand how this is motivational for people. I really do respect his story and how pushing himself so much has helped him overcome what is genuine trauma. But to me, the solutions are different. It's rest, it's finding support in people and peers, it's navigating your trauma in therapy, as opposed to just pushing and pushing and pushing, and every time that you stop pushing, your trauma like comes back. Set Boundaries, Find Peace, A Guide to Reclaiming Yourself by Nedra Glover Tawwab. One of my goals this year was to improve my ability to set boundaries, both with people I love and new people, and with myself. Healthy boundaries help you have a happier life, or so I'm told. And so I had a lot of high hopes for this book. It basically takes you through examples of different life scenarios and different people who have struggled to set boundaries and are therefore being taken advantage of in some way. And it shows how in each scenario, them changing one thing can transform their happiness. The reason I put it low down is because you get the point after 2 chapters. It got quite dry and I struggled to finish it. Then another controversial one, The 4 Agreements. This book is absolutely raved about in the spirituality space. Anyone who's loved The Power of Now, New Earth, that kind of book, which by the way I absolutely adore, they love this book too. The premise is very simple. It goes through 4 simple ideas for life which you should use as rules of thumb in order to be successful as a happy human. For example, one of these rules of life is always being true to your word. It's not that I didn't agree with the principles, I just felt like it lacked nuance. I didn't come away from it feeling very inspired to do those things. Each rule was covered in a really short way. I think I would have appreciated it in context or in story. I don't know, the principles are cool, but I just didn't warm to the book. Pre-suasion. I read this book after a recommendation from one of my friends who studies business and economics. And the whole premise of the book is how you can use knowledge of human psychology in order to be more successful in negotiation or making asks. It's basically everything you do before a negotiation is more important than what you say or do during the negotiation itself. Everything from how you're presenting yourself to making the person trust you, asking the right kind of questions. There are all these little hacks. And I think what maybe didn't resonate with me is how it feels manipulative. Like I am doing these things just so that you think you trust me. So it's like ethically ambiguous, but I also understand that it is really useful and like negotiation needs to happen, it should happen. If you are trying to improve something in your business life, I think it is a wonderful book. It just didn't really resonate with me and my needs right now. Oh, this tea is so good. Gross Anatomy by Mara Altman. This book is kind of like a memoir and it's her personal journey in coming to understand and embrace the female body in all its embarrassing weirdness, in all the ways we've taught to not love it or want to change it. Everything from body hair to weight to sex and orgasms. What felt special about this book firstly is that it was sent to me by a girl who I've kind of mentored, kind of friends with, like I've chatted with her over the last few years as she's built different projects, but I've never met her in person. And she recently launched this incredible game called Boob Blurb. You should check it out. And it's a card game you can play with friends in order to talk about taboo subjects about your body and the female experience. And she also sent me this book with a lovely note in it. I really like this book because it made me reflect on my own journey with my body, my own experimentation with things like not shaving. But at the same time, it also didn't really feel very new to me because I think I had already gone through a lot of that personal journey myself, so it's reiterating a lot of it, but the author writes in a really funny, chill, witty way. So I recommend if you're thinking more about your body and how the world shapes how you think about it. Utopia for realists. We all want a better world. We all want to live in more of a utopia, but most of us don't really know how to get there or what that means. This book explores incredibly specific and realistic measures that we could take in order to make our world more of a utopia based off of research and studies. And it does a deep dive into all of these to convince you why it's a really good idea. So for example, UBI, Universal Basic Income, I read the chapter on it and I was like, sold. UBI is an incredible idea. Or why we need new measures of human happiness, or why the 15-hour work week could be a good idea. I found it really refreshing and optimistic, and I love how it made me think about the fact that a utopia is impossible, because every time you reach a utopia, you can imagine another utopia where something else is made better. Like a utopia should always be iterated, and also how a utopia will never be a utopia for everyone. Like there is no perfect circumstance for everyone because we all want to live different lives. So you kind of just have to compromise in what's the best for everyone. Empowered, turning lemons into lemonade. This is so cool because it was written by my incredible friend V. V Katibu, she's a powerhouse, she's incredible, and she's also not had an easy life growing up. She talks about her journey moving from Zimbabwe to the UK, how she navigated the passing of her father, and how much her mum and her family supported her in her growth and development and how challenging that was for them. It's insane because obviously I know her as a person, so I have so much respect for her, and I think reading her book just deepened the love that I feel for her as a friend. It's also just a practical guide to improve your life. So if you want to feel empowered, go read it. Range, why generalists triumph in a specialized world. This book came at a time where I was really questioning what I want to do with my life, how I feel like specializing just is not something I'm good at. Historically, during my academic life, I've always ended up wanting to study more than one thing. I always chop and change, gain random skills in random things. And so I do identify more as a generalist. And I made a video on this book because it was really refreshing for me to think of generalism as a beneficial thing. It uses a few too many examples, like it's quite a long book. You can read half of it and you can get the point. The School of Life, an Emotional Education. This book has such a cool premise. It's written by Alain de Botton, who is a modern day philosopher. He also has a YouTube channel called School of Life with, I think, like a few million subscribers, and I've often followed their videos. And they push for the idea that school does not teach us the skills that we need interpersonally to have a good life. So things like understanding our own emotions and relationships with other people, understanding ourselves and how we should live our lives based off of who we are. I really enjoy how this was written. There's a lot of harsh realities, but also useful realities. Things like how we grow up romanticizing this monogamous heterosexual relationship between two people who stay together for the rest of their lives and have this perfect, flawless romance and never have doubts and never have other desires, and how marriage is the easiest thing ever, and how communication is just built into a relationship, and all these myths that you as a human have to learn to dispel. It's good, recommend. Oh, we're getting to the final few. Okay, so Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. Wow, I loved this story so much. Trevor Noah is a comedian, but I don't know him super well, and his life story is just incredible. He grew up as a mixed race person under apartheid in South Africa, which was like this discriminatory regime where they created a lot of structure over who could access what based off of race. And it's a story of motherly love and familial love and personal hardship and challenge and coming to know oneself. But it's also really funny because he's just such a witty person, and just overall an easy, incredible read. Recommend. Untamed by Glennon Doyle. So I went into a bookshop, as you do. Come on, Jade, tempt yourself. And I picked this book up off shelf. I read the first page and I knew I needed to buy it. The first line of the book is, 4 years ago, married to the father of my 3 children, I fell in love with a woman. And this book came at a time where I was really questioning my sexuality, and it just felt like what I needed to read at the time. Every chapter is so short, it's just a few pages long, and it's like almost these snippets from her life reflecting on different topics. She talks a lot about people pleasing as a woman and learning to trust her own intuition. She talks a lot about setting boundaries. She talks about falling in love and having to go against what is expected of you in society. I loved it. And finally, my favorite, most impactful book of this year in the non-fiction section is The Defining Decade. I already made a video on this book, but it's all about how to live your 20s in the most productive, happiest way based off of the author's experience. Meg Jay is a psychologist, and she spent her whole career talking to people different ages, but mainly in their 30s, 40s and 50s, about the struggles in their life. And she noticed that so many of the struggles were because of things that people did in their 20s. And so she came up with almost universal pieces of advice that she wishes all 20-year-olds knew in order to increase their chances of having a happier life in their 30s, 40s and beyond. Of course, there are critiques to it, as there are with everything, but I found it really insightful. Okay, I read so many good fiction books this year that it feels wrong to even call some of them worst, but we're just gonna do it. It's based off of what resonated with me at that time, which story I enjoyed the most. Firstly, we have Invisible Man. This book follows the struggles of being a black man in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, that era, and it plays with the idea of him being invisible, how people only see his race, the colour of his skin, as opposed to who he actually is. Really good book. Honestly, I can't remember it that well. I read it in like the start of January. Grey Bees by Andrei Kirkov. I really wanted to read a book by a Ukrainian author because when the Ukraine war started, I was living in a room with my roommate who's one of my best friends, and she's from Ukraine. So the whole time of the war starting was just, it was a lot for all of us, and I'm in a very privileged position to say that it affected me because it didn't affect me directly at all. And during that time I watched a lot of movies, documentaries, read a lot of articles to try and understand the situation more. And this book follows the life of an older man who stays in the Donbas region during the 2014 war. And the area is basically abandoned. The war's still going on. He just doesn't want to leave. He's just chilling in the grey zone, and his childhood enemy is just also in that town, and it's just the two of them. And it's interesting because for about half the book, nothing really happens. It's him just plodding around, living his elderly person life, kind of. It's a very domestic novel, and him being in his head and just thinking a lot, but at the same time as a reader you know that all this danger is closing in on him. So it's like this tension between what feels like a mundane life but being at the center of a war. The reason I put it lower down is because it was quite a slow novel, but generally I did really enjoy it. I would love more recommendations of more books by Ukrainian authors if you have any. Also, the war in Ukraine is very much still going on if you haven't really seen it in the news recently. I'll leave some donation links below. 1,000 Splendid Suns. This book is by an African-American author called Hassini. They also wrote The Kite Runner, if you know that book. This book was painful. I was crying at the end. It is heart-wrenching. It's about this girl who's an illegitimate child born out of marriage, and she's forced into marriage, and it's about this whole journey navigating being a woman without a lot of rights. The Gilded Ones. I love fantasy novels. I love them. I live for them. Superpowers, please. New worlds, give me. I flew through this book. It's such an easy read. It was also so refreshing to have a black female protagonist in a fantasy book. However, I do think it lacks a bit of depth of the characters, and the end was quite rushed. It's fun, but not a throne of glass. God of Small Things. This is set in India, and it's all about the caste system and how it limits love. It's about the relationship between these two twins as they navigate a lot of family trauma. The book is seeped in metaphors and literary brilliance, so that's part of the reason I loved it. If I Had Your Face, this is all about beauty standards in Korea. I loved it partly because I was so shocked when I lived in Seoul about just how strict beauty standards are for women. Guys, I don't know if you know this, but plastic surgery is so common that it's often a graduation gift if you do well in your exams. Like, oh, well done, you got all these stars. Like, now we'll pay for your nose to be changed. If you're interested in that culture and getting to know it more, I highly recommend this book. Ministry for Future. This book has such an interesting premise. I'm really interested in the climate crisis and thinking about solutions to it, and I never really thought about the power of fiction in solution creating. Most of the time when we think about solving the climate crisis, we're thinking about obstacles and constraints and how the world currently is, rather than what fiction allows, which is the power to be fully imaginative. You can't create a different future unless you can imagine it. And it's also a very realistic imagination. It uses a lot of different research about predictions of how the climate crisis could go in order to tell a story of, you know, what it's going to be like in 2040, in 2050, when a lot of countries are starting to experience droughts or crazy heat waves, how governments can handle it, how rebel groups might act. Like, every chapter takes a different stakeholder in the climate crisis and imagines their role in it at different points in the future as things get worse. Girl, Woman, Other. Wow, I saw this book hyped up so much, and I loved its portrayal of being black and British and female and that intersection, and also LGBTQ+ at times. The book takes 12 different stories of black British women, and it's also very experimental with prose and poetry. I loved it because the characters felt really real. I would have liked to see the different stories connect more, but at the same time I really enjoyed it. I finally read Normal People. You've seen this before, Sally Rooney, come on. I don't know why, I think I was avoiding reading this because of how mainstream and hyped it was, but I loved it. Like, nothing happens plot-wise, which scared me a bit, but the way that Rooney writes the most nuanced parts of people and conversations, it just brings such magic to them. Things like when you're talking to someone and, I don't know, the way that they start fiddling with their jumper, like she'll write that, she'll notice that, and it'll add depth to how you think about a character. Her characters felt so real to me, and I loved how mundane the story was. Like, it felt so real and relatable. And also the clumsiness of love. The Picture of Dorian Gray. I just finished this. It's one of those classics I have had on my list forever and just never read. I loved it. I loved the reflections on youth and beauty and love. It made me reflect a lot on how I view myself in the mirror, how my perception of my appearance shapes my perception of self. The Boy, the Mole, the Fox and the Horse. Ruby Granger got me this book for my birthday, and it's a children's book. Well, a children's book, it's a book for everyone. It's gorgeous. It's a book I will read for the rest of my life. It has these wonderful illustrations with every page only having a line or two, but every single line is like its own standalone story. It's about friendship, it's about exploration of self, it's about bravery, and it's one of those books where any single page that you turn to makes you feel better. It's a hug in a book, and I absolutely love it. On the opposite end, we have First They Killed My Father. Now, part of the reason I rated this so highly was because it just hit me so much. I read this on the plane to Cambodia, and it's all about Cambodian history in the 1970s and about the awful genocides that happened under Pol Pot in the Khmer Rouge. It was effectively concentration camps for educated, skilled people in Cambodia. Anyone who lived in a city was taken to these things called killing fields and murdered, essentially. And it follows the story of a really young girl and her family trying to pretend that they're not from a city, so living in a rural life. It is so tragic, it is so hard-hitting, but also I think that's part of why it is such an incredible book, because you can actually feel what it must have been like to be there at that time. And finally, my favourite book of the year so far has to be The Seven Husbands of Evelyn and Hugo. Again, this has been on my TBR list forever. I've seen it on my TikTok for like a year. I devoured it. I devoured it in like a day and a half. It's all about the pressures of fame in old Hollywood. It's all about the difference between marriage and love. It's about how love takes so many different forms, how love can also be friendship and platonic and be just as powerful and meaningful as romantic love. It features queer love in a time where queer love was not accepted yet. I absolutely loved it. I'm not going to say any more. If you can read one book this year, it is The Seven Husbands of Evelyn and Hugo. Please do it. I gave it to Folkert because I was like, Folk, you have to read this book. He read it in like a day. And that's it. Guys, I've been filming for 1 hour and 20 minutes. This is one of the longest videos I've filmed for a long time. Is that what BookTube is? I can just talk and talk and talk about these books. Again, please don't feel pressure to read a lot. Like, just don't feel pressure. Like, I've gone through years where I literally read like 5 books or like 1 book or no books. Reading should not be a chore, but I would love to inspire you to pick up a book or 2 from my list. If anything resonates with you, do your own research, see if you want to read it. I hope you have a reflective, gorgeous, wonderful summer. Let me know if you want more book videos. This is very like out of what I normally do, so let me know. If you made it to the end of this hefty video, comment me a tea emoji. Anything like a tea, a cup, a coffee, and any of those comments will get love from me, because how on earth did you get to this point? All the love. Bye.